Good afternoon. The committee will come to order. I'd like to welcome everyone, and our colleagues will be here shortly. We're going to have votes here that's going to interrupt us probably any minute, and then I'm going to try to get my statement in, probably the ranking member, as soon as he gets here. So we'd like to welcome the folks here, the witnesses, and the members as they come to the Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific. The ranking member, Mr. Feli-Mavega, is not able to be here today, so Mr. Berra will sit in his place this afternoon. Mr. Berra and I will make opening statements, and other members will be recognized for 1 minute, assuming the timing goes right for all this. In many ways, the Burma we see today is much different than the one we knew only a few years ago, at least at first glance. The sudden and unexpected democratic transition, which opened Burma's frontier to the world, was welcomed by democracy advocates everywhere. In fact, I traveled to Burma in August last year and saw a number of these changes. To be sure, we're all pleased that Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi is finally free and a duly elected member of Parliament. The same can be said of the regime's actions to release nearly 30,000 jailed citizens, of which 1,071 were political prisoners. However, as we have seen, the political and social situation in Burma is extremely fragile, and there is still much work to be done. The escalation of human rights abuses committed by the Burmese military and the civil unrest between Burma's Buddhist majority and Muslim minority is threatening the progression of future political reforms. Regrettably, the rise of anti-Muslim violence has so far displaced over 250,000 individuals, destroyed over 10,000 homes, and killed nearly 300 people. Evidence shows the Burmese military perpetrated some of these attacks directly. In other situations, the military and police just stood by and watched the violence unfold. What is not often mentioned is that over the last year or so, nearly 1,000 Rohingya and 200 Kachin prisoners of conscience have been arrested and detained for their religion or ethnicity, or practicing their right to freedom of assembly. This, I think most would agree, is unacceptable. A year ago, President Obama received 11 commitments from President Thein Sein, which were reaffirmed in May when he made an official visit to the White House. However, those commitments remain largely ignored. These unfulfilled promises include establishing a UN High Commissioner for Human Rights office, allowing international humanitarian access to conflict areas, taking decisive action in the Rakhine State to end discrimination of the Rohingya Muslims, and ending illicit weapons deals with North Korea, among others. Despite substantial evidence that reforms are languishing behind a corrupt governing system that is still being manipulated by the veiled hands of the military, the Obama administration has moved forward with offers of more rewards, deals, and concessions. Over the last year, the administration has lifted investment sanctions, lifted import bans, allowed Burma's military to observe Cobra Gold, the largest military exercise in the world, lifted visa bans on top Burmese politicians, hosted President Thein Sein at the White House, signed a trade and investment framework agreement, began the process of admitting Burma into the Generalized System of Preferences program, and initiated military-to-military engagement. It is as a result of these actions that today's hearing is being called to examine the administration's decision to transition from an action-for-action engagement strategy to one that I believe it labels as proactive. This contrasts with America's longstanding Burma policy that enjoyed support on both sides of the aisle. Years of bipartisan cooperation of Congress, which resulted in the imposition of widespread sanctions on Burma, is now, I'm afraid, being overlooked. As the administration has raced to turn Burma into its success story, I believe its engagement strategy has lost sight of the realities on the ground and has become hasty and, I'm afraid, also misguided. I do not believe the administration has provided enough time for nascent political reforms in Burma to take root. As a result, it's premature to assess whether the changes we have seen are genuine, because Burma has not yet demonstrated it is committed to a long-term path of democratic governance. Constitutional revisions that implement reforms at the central and local levels have not occurred. So until this happens, all the optimism and hope is purely speculation. Specifically, I want to focus on the administration's unilateral decision to pursue engagement with Burma's military. As we have seen elsewhere in the world, unconditioned military assistance can lead to unanticipated outcomes. Absent any fixed expectations or benchmarks to measure reforms, the U.S. is throwing away what may be, since most sanctions have been lifted, its last point of leverage that could help foster further reforms in Burma. In early June, then-Secretary Leon Panetta stated that the U.S. was interested in improving its military ties with Burma if that country continued implementing democratic reforms and improved its human rights record. Less than 6 months later, reforms have stalled, and the country faces a situation U.S. Ambassador Mitchell calls, quote, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, unquote, and human rights abuses continue. Nevertheless, the U.S. is still moving forward on a policy fueled by hope. The administration's decision to pursue a military-to-military relationship with Burma ignores and disregards the concerns of Burma's ethnic minorities who continue to express their opposition. They believe preconditions must be first met before these relations progress any further. With that in mind, I hope today's witnesses will finally detail the administration's short and long-term plans to implement its policy, including how military engagement will end the Burmese military's perpetration of human rights violations, help Burma achieve national reconciliation, reform Burma's constitution, or create an independent judiciary. And I hope we can learn how it plans to proceed in working with military leaders who have not demonstrated a sincere interest in reforms, have not ended violations of human rights laws, have not adhered to ceasefire agreements, and have not held their own accountable for their horrendous crimes. Without such a roadmap, it remains very unclear whether future reforms in Burma will be consistent with goals established under U.S. laws. Lastly, the reopening of the USAID mission in Burma was an important step in our engagement strategy because there is a critical need for Americans on the ground to assess what is actually happening there. At the same time, with all these lingering concerns about Burma's future, it is prudent that U.S. assistance is targeting those areas and helping those communities in most need. So I hope today's witnesses can also provide us with more details about the growing foreign assistance budget for Burma and those areas where additional funding has been requested. And I would also note that we'll be welcoming the gentleman from New York, Mr. Crawley, and the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Franks, this afternoon. They'll be joining us. I ask unanimous consent that they be permitted to speak and ask questions after members of the subcommittee have done so without objection so ordered. Obviously, Mr. Ami is not here yet this afternoon. Mo, would you like to make an opening statement? Okay, then what we'll do is go into recess here while we go over and vote. We'll be back in a little while. I'm not sure how many votes we have. 2 votes, so I'm guessing it'll be approximately a half hour. So apologize for any inconvenience to everybody. It's kind of hurry up and wait things, but votes have been called, so we have to go and do our constitutional duty. So we'll be back shortly. So we're in recess. Thank you. statement, and so I've already given my opening statement, so I'm going to go right to you. And, and I already said that locally, and Trent Fraggs could speak and stuff, which is fine. But and if he wants to make an opening statement after you, it'd be a minute, but he can't. So are you ready?
Sure.
Okay. Committee will come back to order. Okay, I've already given my opening statement. I would now like to recognize Ami Berry, who is filling in for Mr. Feli Vega this afternoon as a ranking member, and we've already recognized that Mr. Moakley of New York and Mr. Franks of Arizona will be able to speak, and if they'd like to give an opening statement for 1 minute, they would have that opportunity as well. I now recognize Mr. Berry for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Chabot, and thank you for the witnesses on this incredibly important hearing. Obviously, as we look to Burma as a country and a future democratic ally, it is a nation that is at a crossroads, emerging from, what certainly has been a difficult past and hopefully a future filled with promise, but certainly that opportunity is not without challenge. And I certainly look forward to hearing your testimony as witnesses of how we as a nation that fosters democracy advance in that challenge. Last couple of years, the Burmese government has certainly made progress in instituting a number of democratic practices and a number of democratic reforms. Certainly the release of political prisoners, the inking of a ceasefire agreement, and allowing the opposition to participate in Parliament are noteworthy events that occurred in Burma. That said, despite this progress, the challenges in building a nation that celebrates its rich and ethnic and religious diversity remain. A few weeks ago, maybe a few months ago, we had a prior hearing on some of the ethnic issues and faith-based challenges that are occurring in the northern part of Burma. And certainly those challenges remain of great concern to most of us on this committee. We certainly are concerned about the ongoing violence and human rights abuses that we see occurring in Burma. Also, as the world's greatest democracy, we have to have a role, and I do believe our Burmese engagement policy should continue to be committed to seeing national reconciliation, transparency, and ethnic equality. We've also got to send a very clear message that we will not tolerate these human rights abuses and oppression. In addition, if military engagement continues with Burma, this arrangement must be strategically tailored with firm and clear human rights benchmarks aimed to drive the political reform that we hope to see. The U.S. needs to remain a strong supporter in South Asia and a leader in the global community in order to advance the respect and the rule of law and human rights. I look forward to hearing your positions. I look forward to reviewing our positions and policies on Burma and our role as the world's leading democracy in continuing a peaceful transition from military repression to a country of democratic rule. Thank you, and I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Berry. I appreciate it. The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Franks, is recognized for 1 minute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for the opportunity to raise such a critical issue and one here where the United States can have a truly serious impact. One of the topics of this hearing will be how the Department of State and Department of Defense are reviewing military-to-military engagement with the Burmese Army, or the Burmese military. The Burmese military happens to be one of the worst oppressors of human rights in recent history, and I urge the administration to work closely with Congress throughout this process. The U.S. needs a policy response that is more long-term than just lifting military sanctions and setting broad objectives for mill-to-mill engagement, especially if we intend to be a leader in the region and help Burma become a more rights-respecting country. We must have clear benchmarks for the Burmese military before any sanctions on the military are lifted. We know that the Burmese military wants the relationship with our military. Our actions must incentivize the military to reform. Benchmarks should focus on the implementation of constitutional reforms that curb the military's control over the civilian government, transparency and accountability by the military, and to end abuses of ethnic and religious minorities. I recently returned from a congressional delegation to the Philippines, and among the many things I learned there during that trip was how the U.S. can have extensive impact on these countries in Southeast Asia. The U.S. now has an opportunity to make a positive impact in Burma, but we must proceed extremely wisely and leverage the relationship we now have with Burma to encourage the necessary reforms. And I thank you, Chairman Chabot, for the opportunity to speak today and for addressing this very vital topic in your hearing, and I thank all of you for being here.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Crawley, is recognized for 1 minute for making an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also, if I could, if you could pause the clock for a moment, I did note that you referred to me as Mr. Moakley.
I
and
apologize.
If I could be compared to any great Irish American, it would be Mr. Moakley. So thank you very much.
And that's what I had in mind. So,
I thank you for holding this hearing today, as well as my colleagues for being here, particularly Mr. Ami Berra, Congressman Berra from California, for his interest, and Mr. Falimo Vega from our side as well. Ini Falimo Vega has been a great champion of the U.S.-Asia relations for many, many years. I'm sorry he can't be here today. Many of you know that I am the lead sponsor of legislation that imposed many of the sanctions on Burma, the Block Burmese Jade Act in particular. I worked on this with our then-ranking member, Tom Lantos, and fully took the responsibility of the legislation on after his passing. I also worked very closely with Mr. Lantos on the Burmese Freedom and Democracy Act. He was someone who was a true champion for human rights throughout the world, and Burma was no less a place of interest for Mr. Lantos. We miss him. As you know, the position of the Special Envoy to Burma, the list of individuals targeted for sanctions called the Specially Designated Nationals, or SDN list, and many other sanctions were created by the JADE Act, which I authored. All that being said, I have to be honest, I am increasingly concerned about the approach our administration has recently begun to take with respect to Burma, especially our apparent plans for mill-to-mill relations and the furtherance of them. And keep in mind, I am someone who initially supported the administration's policy of action for action, but I think we're going well beyond that now. I'm not opposed to talking to the Burmese regime, but I am against unilaterally lifting all sanctions and pressures and granting much sought-after military training if the situation in Burma is stalled or further rolled back. I have a more extensive opening statement, Mr. Chairman. I won't read all, but once again, focusing on, I think, a premature stage of moving towards more open relations, mill-to-mill relations, really going from DILS to EIMET too soon, in my opinion. There has not been enough action for action. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses, and I welcome them today, but I look forward also to the question and answer period, from which I will be a little bit more direct. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
thank you very much. And without objection, the gentleman's full statement will be entered into the record. I'd now like to turn to the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, who is the chairman of the Europe, Eurasia, and Emerging Threats Subcommittee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. If there's a message the government of Burma needs to hear from the Congress, is you are not ready to be accepted into the family of free nations yet. You have made progress, but not enough. And we expect certain things to be addressed if you are indeed to be accepted as a legitimate democratic government, as with the other democratic governments in the world. The Burmese military is still conducting brutal and bloody operations against the ethnic peoples on the Thai-Burma border. The Burmese government is permitting genocidal brutality against the Muslim population living in the western part of their country. And again, I might add, Mr. Chairman, if indeed the Muslims of the world who are trying to, the moderate Muslims who are opposing radical Islam in this world are to take the West seriously, we must make sure that we are loud and clear when Muslims are being murdered genocidally in countries like Burma. So we need to step up, and we cannot start treating Burma as I say, a democratic country where their job is done until we see some progress, especially in those areas. The Burmans, one last point, I'm sorry. The Burmans were repressed by a horrible government, and I was proud to have stood with these people for 20 years. They stood against this brutal dictatorship, but now what we see emerging is a country in which the Burmans are free, but the Muslims are not, and the ethnic tribal people are not. That is not acceptable to the people of the United States if Burma is to be treated like any other democratic country. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to recognize the presence this afternoon of Congressman Perry from Pennsylvania, and I understand that no opening statement is necessary. Okay, thank you very much. And before I introduce the witnesses, I'd also like to recognize we have a number of Burmese parliamentarians with us here this afternoon, and if they want to stand up and be recognized, we'd like to welcome you to the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific. So if you'd like to stand, we can recognize you. Thank you for being here. Thank you very much. And I'd now like to introduce our distinguished panel here this afternoon. We first have Judah Sefkin, who is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service. Prior to assuming her duties as Senior Burma Advisor, she served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok, Thailand from 2010 to 2013. She previously served as the Ambassador's Staff Assistant and as a political officer. Since entering the Foreign Service in 1983, Ms. Sefkin has had overseas postings in Mexico City, Paris, and in Manila. She has also served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and as a desk officer for Rwanda, Burundi, and the Central African Republic, Deputy Director of the Office of Western European Affairs, and as Director of the Office of Nordic and Baltic Affairs. She received a BA in Government from Smith College and a Master's in International Relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science. We welcome you this afternoon. And I'd also like to welcome Deputy Assistant Secretary Vikram Singh. Excuse me, and he is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia within the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs. Mr. Singh serves as the Principal Advisor for all policy matters pertaining to development and implementation of defense strategies for the South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Before his appointment in April 2012, Mr. Singh served as Senior Advisor to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy on Asian and Pacific Security Affairs. He was a Deputy Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the Department of State. Mr. Singh lived and worked in Sri Lanka, where he ran a Ford Foundation program on minority rights and conflict in Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, and reported on the Sri Lankan Civil War. He holds degrees from the University of California at Berkeley and Columbia University, and we welcome you here, Mr. Singh. And finally, we have Deputy Assistant Administrator Gregory Beck, who serves as Deputy Assistant Administrator for Asia and has management and oversight responsibilities for all USAID programs in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. He has over 15 years of senior-level leadership experience in development and in conflict and post-conflict environments, including in Asia, Africa, and the Balkans and Caucasus. He was formerly Director of the Office of Humanitarian Assistance with CHF International, and he held a number of positions with the International Rescue Committee, including as Senior Regional Director of Asia and Country Director in Somalia, Kenya, Rwanda, and Croatia. During Mr. Beck's career with the IRC, he led emergency response teams in Somalia, Rwanda, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Burma. Mr. Beck has a master's degree in environmental engineering from the California State University at Humboldt and a bachelor's degree in foreign service and international politics from Pennsylvania State University. He speaks Nepalese and has studied Thai, Kiswahili, Croatian, in Kinyarwanda. So it's a mouthful. So we appreciate the presence, and we're looking forward to your testimony this afternoon. So Ms. Sefkin, we'll turn to you first. We do have the 5-minute rule in effect here. The yellow light will come on, letting you know you have 1 minute to wrap up. The red light will come on, and we'd appreciate it if you would complete your testimony close to that time, if at all possible. So Ms. Sefkin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Chabot, Ranking Member Berra, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today about U.S. policy toward Burma and the important transition that is underway in that country. Members of Congress, and particularly those on this committee, have been powerful proponents of human rights and democracy in Burma over the past 2 decades. I know that we share the goal of supporting reforms that complete Burma's transition to become a democratic, peaceful, prosperous member of the world community. We tackle this test cheered by the advances that have been made, yet cognizant of the substantial challenges that remain. Thank you for your past and future partnership in supporting Burma's reform progress. When then Assistant Secretary Campbell testified before this committee in April 2012, a historic by-election had just brought Aung San Suu Kyi and 42 other members of the opposition National League for Democracy into government. But the NLD members had not yet taken their seats in Parliament. Today, they are active leaders there. Since 2011, the government of Burma has released over 1,100 political prisoners. It has substantially eased media censorship. Burma has signed the International Atomic Energy Additional Protocol and taken steps towards fulfilling its obligation to implement UN Security Council resolutions concerning North Korea. And the government and ethnic armed groups have intensified efforts to achieve peace and national reconciliation. Nearly 4 years after we started down the path of principled engagement, the culture of reform in Burma is increasingly self-driven. Yet, Burma's transition remains fragile. The lifting of the authoritarian regime's heavy hand has exposed long-standing challenges, including a struggle to define national identity. Communal conflict and anti-Muslim discrimination have been unleashed in Rakhine State and across the country. Rule of law, including efforts to promote justice and accountability, continue to be inadequate, and the military remains closely tied to politics and the economy. Power and the benefit of Burma's vast natural resources remain concentrated in the hands of a few. These challenges will be neither quickly nor easily remedied. Nevertheless, our surest road to helping Burma comes through a strategy of engagement that seeks to assist the country proactively in its transition to democracy and development. This is a unique opportunity in modern Burmese history. The people of the country are calling for enhanced U.S. engagement in virtually all sectors, and we must work tirelessly to ensure that the reforms become irreversible. I'd like to briefly touch on 4 key pillars of U.S. policy. The first is promoting national peace and reconciliation. This is Burma's defining challenge, a challenge that has eluded the country since its independence. Without peace and national unity, other reforms will be at risk. To support the peace process, our ambassador, Derek Mitchell, and his embassy team meet regularly with the government and with ethnic representatives of all ethnic groups to encourage an inclusive, transparent peace process. We're supporting efforts to rebuild trust, and we continue to urge all parties to respect the human rights of civilian populations. To counter the disturbing communal violence and anti-Muslim discrimination that has racked Burma, particularly in Rakhine State, we are promoting messages of tolerance, and we continue to urge the government to improve security for all vulnerable populations and to ensure unimpeded humanitarian access to conflict areas. In addition, we are urging efforts to reintegrate communities, and we are pressing the government to implement a path to citizenship for the Rohingya. Turning to a related area of focus, supporting democracy and human rights remains a critical pillar of our policy. We continue to press for the release of all political prisoners and to advocate for the opening of a UN Office of Human Rights. We're implementing programs to strengthen civil society and build democratic institutions. We're also encouraging the revision of laws necessary to protect democratic rights. The need for constitutional reform to allow citizens to freely elect the leaders of their choice, to recognize the rights of minorities, and to establish civilian control of the military is part of this discussion. And this leads me to mention the importance we attach to promoting security sector reform. A military under civilian control that protects the people, promotes human rights, and respects international law is a pillar of democracy and essential to the success of the reforms. Our voice must be heard on this critical issue. We believe that a carefully calibrated military engagement to share lessons of how militaries operate in a democratic framework will strengthen the hand of reformers and is one of the best tools for shaping Burma's most powerful institution at this juncture. My colleague Vikram Singh will elaborate on this, including the benefit Title 22 authorities would offer to provide Burmese military more consistent and structured exposure to international human rights and military justice standards. Let me just briefly touch on two other policy areas. One is supporting—
If you could just wrap up, because you're actually over time now.
Okay, supporting Burma's transition to transparent, open market economy that promotes sustainable growth. And the last is also to I'd highlight Burma. We want Burma to be a contributor to regional and global security. And just to say that our continued engagement to effect positive change in Burma is grounded in our strategic interest in a successful, politically, economically progressive Asia-Pacific region and in the fundamental values that go to the core of who we are as a nation. So to prevail and keep our focus on long-term goals, we feel that we must have a strategic approach that is steady and considered but flexible in implementation to keep pace with conditions on the ground. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to continued consultation and cooperation with you on these important issues, and I want to thank you again for inviting me to testify today, and I will look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Singh, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. I really want to thank you for inviting me to speak with you today about our engagement with Burma, and I will be summarizing my comments in an effort to stay under 5 minutes. Congress has been instrumental in shaping U.S. policy with Burma, and the Department of Defense views Congress as a critical partner in developing and implementing a strategy for careful, calibrated re-engagement with the military in Burma. The military in Burma remains critical to the ultimate success of reform efforts and a full transition to democracy. We believe the Burmese military is positioned to continue supporting the government's reform program and is interested in taking steps to modernize, professionalize, and reform itself. At the same time, we are fully cognizant the military in Burma retains a prominent role in political and economic life, faces allegations of ongoing human rights abuses, and retains ties to North Korea. It is very clear that a meaningful and sustainable transition for this country and for its military will take many years. Given this complex reality of the military's role in Burma, our policy supports two clear goals. First, encouraging the military to continue its support for reforms, and second, enhancing the military's understanding of and ability to respect human rights and civilian authority and control. The Department of Defense has worked closely with the Department of State to develop a limited and calibrated set of engagements with the Burmese military in support of these goals. The steps we are taking are in line with the recommendations of a range of Burmese stakeholders, including members of the opposition and ethnic groups who urge us to carefully engage the armed forces to build their support for the reform agenda and to help the military itself modernize and transform. So far, DoD's only interactions in the last 2 years have been limited diplomatic engagement, including through the U.S.-Burma Human Rights Dialogue and pull-asides with Burmese counterparts at multilateral meetings. The resumption of accounting operations for U.S. personnel missing from World War II and unaccounted for in Burma. Workshops and exchanges by the Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies on rule of law, civil-military relations, and civilian control of the military. Supporting Thailand's request to have Burmese observers at Cobra Gold to observe the staff planning and humanitarian portions of that exercise. Initial exchanges by the Defense Institute of International Legal Studies to share views on human rights law and the law of armed conflict. These interactions have been largely symbolic. They have not included any training or education. Under current restrictions, we cannot undertake training or education programs, such as DIL's courses on human rights and international humanitarian law. But our limited engagements, we feel, have begun to expose the military to international norms of behavior and to foster some new trust and understanding. Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, the Department does not seek and is not recommending the full normalization of bilateral defense ties with Burma at this time. We are not suggesting the resumption of foreign military financing or full international military education and training, otherwise known as IMAT. Barring significant further progress, the engagement we seek will be limited and calibrated. Over the next year, we hope to continue the existing activities we have started and to expand DIL's engagement to include some formal training in human rights and other related areas for Burmese military officials. We see value in engagement that would support institutional changes required to promote better civil-military relations, increased transparency, and greater civilian oversight. We also recommend initiating steps to build Burma's capacity for disaster relief to deal with things like Cyclone Nargis in 2008. The Department looks forward to working with Congress to craft these engagements appropriately. All engagements we will do will fully adhere to relevant sanctions, policy restrictions, and vetting requirements. It is important to note that under current sanctions, we lack any dedicated mechanism for this kind of reform-oriented engagement with the Burmese military. The main tool for this kind of process is expanded IMAT, which is a scaled and targeted subset of IMAT that allows only education and training related to civilian control of the military, improving military justice in accordance with internationally recognized human rights, proper management of defense resources, and cooperation between the police and military for counter-narcotics. We look forward to working with Congress on some version of this kind of programming so reform-focused engagement can be more transparent and regularized. I know I'm coming to the end of my time, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned examples of benchmarks we would want to see. Those are many of the same things that the administration looks for: international access for international humanitarian organizations, accountability in the Burmese military. And given that I'm coming to the end of my time, I also just want to acknowledge that I recognize there's considerable skepticism about what value this kind of military engagement might provide. We believe that this kind of engagement is part of our principled stance with regard to reform and supporting democracy and reform in Burma. And we know there can be no guarantee that our engagement will bring about the changes we seek. But we do believe we have an opportunity to engage for the first time in decades with a military and government in Burma open to implementing reforms and accepting U.S. advice to that end. We believe we need to move forward with that opportunity in a careful way, in close consultation with the Congress and our friends and allies who share these objectives. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to taking questions from you and the subcommittee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Singh. Mr. Beck, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bera, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on USAID's work in Burma. I'd like to first acknowledge the role that this committee and Congress have played in our engagement and our advocacy of human rights, democracy, national reconciliation, and economic reform. We believe the recent historic reforms can be sustained with continued targeted efforts that support the needs and aspirations of the people of Burma. However, we remain conscious of the fragile state of reforms and reconciliation taking place in the country. Since the reopening of USAID's mission over a year ago, and under the strong leadership of Ambassador Mitchell, USAID's activities have been focused on supporting the U.S. government's priority policy objectives in Burma. Specifically, they reinforce the 4 principles outlined in the U.S.-Burma Partnership for Democracy, Peace, and Prosperity. The principles of inclusivity, transparency, accountability, and local empowerment. In the spirit of these principles, we are targeting our programming towards 4 key areas at this critical juncture in Burma's transition: democratic reform, national peace and reconciliation, economic reforms towards inclusive growth, and building healthy and resilient communities. In partnership with the people of Burma, we're helping to build the foundation for a peaceful and sustained transition to democracy. Our assistance supports strengthening Burma's nascent democratic and political processes and institutions by promoting free and fair elections, supporting political party development, building the capacity of Parliament, and providing broad assistance to civil society. As an example, a USAID program brought civil society and Parliament together for the first time to draft national legislation. The result of this historic collaboration was a new association law that is more in line with international standards and gives a greater voice and strength to civil society. This process was hailed by both civil society and members of Parliament as a model for the future. Through direct engagement with the people, USAID is ensuring that Burma adopts legitimate and sustainable processes that enable the pursuit of national reconciliation. For instance, our Project for Local Empowerment is working in conflict-prone regions of Burma to create linkages between local border groups, communities, and government officials that promote trust and cooperation. We partner with over 100 local organizations, from human rights groups to humanitarian assistance providers, to help them carry out their vision for Burma. Looking forward, the continued development of the Burmese economy requires responsible foreign and domestic investment. Reforms to the country's legal system are needed to encourage investment that benefits the lives of the people of Burma, protects their environment, and encourages a transparent land tenure system. Towards these goals, we have assumed leadership of the Donor Coordination Mechanism for Agriculture, contributed significant input into the recently approved Farmer Rights Protection Act, and provided technical expertise on the developing land use policies. We've also forged milestone public-private partnerships between American universities and companies such as Cisco, Microsoft, and Hewlett-Packard to provide leadership training, promote and encourage entrepreneurship, and assist small to medium-sized businesses. But for all of our gains to take root, a healthy, resilient population is necessary for sustained economic growth. Over the past few years, USAID has become a leader in the health sector in Burma, making significant contributions towards combating child and maternal mortality, HIV/AIDS, malaria, and drug-resistant tuberculosis. By focusing in these areas, we are reaching people who were previously unable to access basic health care. Beyond this, our multi-sector Chabot program works in over 1,000 villages, bringing clean drinking water to over 300,000 people. Additionally, over 38,000 people have improved access to health care, 12,000 farmers are using improved agriculture technologies, and over 6,000 community-based organizations and women's groups have received U.S. government assistance to strengthen their ability to support their communities and to better engage with their governments. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, the USAID mission in Burma is well on its way to establishing a model mission that maximizes our investment by embracing partnerships and alliances in all that we do. Whether it be with the private sector, international organizations, academia, local groups, or civil society, the relationships and partnerships we forge will provide a catalytic platform for continued engagement to improve the lives of the people of Burma and ensure a safer, more prosperous future for all. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the testimony of the panel this afternoon, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for purpose of asking questions. Last week, Aung San Suu Kyi gave a speech during her trip to Australia where she said, and I quote, "Those of you who think that Burma has successfully taken the path to reform would be mistaken. If you want to know why you are mistaken, you only have to study the Burmese Constitution. If you read it carefully, you will understand why we can't have genuine democracy under such a constitution," unquote. Burma's constitution has many severe flaws. No civilian control of the military, no independence of the judiciary, no protections and rights for minorities. 25% of the seats in Parliament are reserved for the military, and it bars Aung San Suu Kyi and others from becoming president. What is the administration doing to support the universal call for Aung San Suu Kyi and the people of Burma to advance constitutional reform before the 2015 elections? And Ms. Efkin, if you'd like to take that.
Certainly. We very much agree with the priority you attach to that issue. And first of all, you may be aware that there is a process underway in the country. The Parliament has established a committee to review the current Constitution and to make recommendations as to changes, amendments that should be considered. As you know, constitutional amendments can be a very challenging process in a number of countries, and in Burma it's no exception. It will require, first of all, changes will require a vote of 75% of the members of Parliament, and then many of the issues, probably most of the issues, will have to go to national referendum. We are engaged in the discussion, and we have made very clear our expectation that this has to be a priority, that Burma will not realize its full democratic potential until the Constitution is reformed. And as the same issues you cited are issues that we regularly cite, the fact that it is absolutely critical, it will be critical that for the upcoming elections to be seen as credible, that the people of Burma are able to freely choose their leadership in free and fair elections. Of course, it's up to the people of Burma to choose their leadership, but they should have the right to choose their leadership, the candidates that they feel best represent them. There are a number of other issues that are equally important, and a key one is the rights of minorities. That will be part of the discussion that we hope will be launched very soon as part of the political dialogue for a durable peace. So that, of course, there will be many aspects to that will be take time to determine what changes need to be made, but that is also a priority. And as you mentioned, the civilian control of the military is another priority. So we, have made clear our position, our expectations, our hopes for the country, and we are certainly willing to provide them technical assistance if it is helpful to them as they undergo this very important challenge.
Let me also ask, what are the implications of statements from the administration saying whatever reforms Burma achieves by the end of this year are the only reforms we're likely to see in Burma until the 2015 elections? Because its government will be so focused on chairing ASEAN next year. Is the administration really willing to accept such lack of progress?
No, not at all. That is not anything that we would subscribe to. We do recognize there will be challenges, that the government is very focused increasingly on its ASEAN responsibilities, but that does not mean we will in any way flag in our continuing our dialogue and our encouragement and pressure to them to move forward on the reforms.
All right, thank you. Mr. Singh, I've only got about a minute, so let me get quickly to a question. According to the U.S. State Department's 2011 report to Congress on military and intelligence aid to Burma, Burma's primary foreign suppliers of weapons and military-related technologies were state-controlled arms companies from China, North Korea, Russia, and Belarus. There is little doubt North Korean companies are still supporting Burma's efforts to build and operate military-related production facilities. So although Burma signed the IAEA additional protocol on September 17, 2013, there's still no clear evidence that Burma has halted its military relationship with North Korea. A relationship between Burma and North Korea has been and continues to be entirely unacceptable. Does Burma intend to completely sever ties with North Korea or not?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Burmese government has decided to end the military relationship with North Korea. But we believe that is the direction they are going. We do not believe that is complete. And I would be very happy to discuss in more detail what we think to be true about this in a classified setting. We see as of primary importance to us and actually many of our allies and partners the full severing of Burma's ties to the DPRK as really critical to advancing beyond anything other than this initial re-engagement we've been talking about.
I would certainly agree that that's critical. And my time has expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Barra, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Chabot. Let me direct my first questions to Mr. Singh. Obviously, Burma sits at a very critical juncture, between China, between an emerging relationship with India, and offers some critical access to trade routes and so forth. But from a military perspective, certainly sits at a critical juncture. It does look like India is increasing some of its military sales to Burma, as well as offering assistance and so forth at a similar time that China obviously is providing a lot as well. How do you see this playing out in terms of vis-a-vis some of the relationships between India and China as well, just from your perspective, and then the U.S.'s role?
Thank you, Congressman Barra. I think I need to just very briefly say hello to you from my mother-in-law and father-in-law, who are constituents in California, Dr. and Mrs. Balmer. We really welcome the engagement of India with Burma. India and the United States have long had very similar aspirations and goals for Burma, though we've often had very different policy approaches to it. We believe that overall, India's re-engagement with Burma on a whole host of issues will be positive. I would say that we will probably have disagreements about specifics about what that looks like. So, for example, moves into arms sales and other things would be things that we might be concerned about. That said, I think it is incredibly important for Burma to start interacting with militaries other than those that have been their traditional partners and suppliers, and with governments that have been other than their traditional partners. So we welcome that development. We believe China will try to maintain a relationship with Burma, and Burma is finding itself having, for the first time in many years, to actually figure out where it wants to place its bets, where it wants to put its cards, who it wants to deal with. We'd like to shape the kinds of choices that Burma makes through how we go through this delicate process of re-engagement, with supporting reform at the center of how we approach things.
Great. Let me ask, let me see, Sifkin, with elections coming up, and the chairman touched on what, how we shape free and fair elections. What would you define in 2015 as being a fair election in Burma, if we were to look for some standards that we would want to shoot for?
Yes, and let me also mention, and my colleague Greg Beck may want to elaborate, but part of our assistance actually is also working with the Election Commission in Burma to help approve its efficiency and ability to monitor and help implement free and fair elections. We would want to see the ability of all Burmese citizens, obviously, to go to the polls, to register, to vote freely, and evidence that there is no fraud or very limited fraud in the conduct of elections, that the campaign was conducted in a free and transparent manner, absent intimidation, that candidates are able to access areas that they represent, and that the citizens of the areas they represent are able to get to the polls. I think a lot will depend, of course, on what changes they decide to advance as far as there has been discussion in the country. Do they want to keep the current electoral system, or do they want to go to a proportional system? Those kinds of issues are issues for the people to decide. But, in accordance with whatever system they do choose, ultimately that it be, free, everybody's freely allowed to participate. That's a very broad, general answer to your question.
Mr. Beck.
I might add that we do have, as a part of our Rule of Law project, we're working with the Union Election Commission, helping to enhance their systems and processes, also to enhance access to polling stations, working with civil society to build out on voter education, and also to work as monitors during the elections.
Great. In my last 30 seconds, one thing we've talked about on this committee and in the full committee has been one of the core pillars of democracy is, within the rule of law, property right laws. Could you just briefly touch on, any one of you, what property rights in Burma look like today?
That's actually a problem, and a problem that needs to be addressed. We do know that there are senior officials in the government that are grappling with it. My understanding is currently there are not really clear property rights in the country, and the problem of land seizures, land grabs is a big problem. But we have heard, and certainly this will very much be tied to our development work in agriculture, that there needs to be clarity and there needs to be reform to provide for clear land rights.
Gentleman's time has expired, and I would just note that the members of the witnesses can definitely score points with the panels if they can send greetings from their parents. That definitely is a good move. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm particularly concerned or interested in the U.S. policy towards Burma. Some of the things I understand, it seems like we're relaxing policy a little bit as a way of, I guess, turning the page, and I see where at least it describes in the document that I'm looking at, democratically elected civilian government, human rights, and those type of things, especially to ethnic minorities. But it doesn't mention our policy regarding nuclear ambitions. And if you could, I'm sorry, Jeffkin, if you can elaborate on that, I'd appreciate it.
Well, that is very much remains a very key policy priority area for us. As my colleague Vikram Singh said, we have seen positive steps that have been taken by the government to cut off the trade, the arms trade with North Korea, but we cannot yet say that that has been completely implemented. As far as nuclear goes, I think at this point we could certainly, arrange to come back in another setting to discuss in more detail, but the nuclear bit is less the concern than other systems, I think, at this point.
Okay, so do we have, is their relationship with North Korea, is that a showstopper for the United States?
Well, first of all, it's part of their international obligation to adhere to UN Security Council resolutions. So,
but we've seen those kind of things eroded in the past in other negotiations with other nations where we say no further than this, unless you want to talk about it. So
right.
what is our position?
Certainly, there are many things that we will not be able to do to engage them on absent their full compliance on that issue. And on the issue of military, that's very much true, that we cannot foresee a full normalization absent them their having fully complied on that need.
Okay. So on the human rights abuses, particularly with the ethnic minorities, the Christians, the Muslims, et cetera, and the military involvement in that. While I understand the increased dialogue, so to speak, as opposed to the stick, as opposed to the carrot, so to speak. I mean, do we trust these folks enough to do that under dialogue as opposed to the boot? I hate to put it that way, but and do we have quantitative benchmarks, including a timeline, for their compliance with any of those things?
Let me start to answer, and I'll turn to Vikram perhaps to add a bit more. I guess one thing to keep in mind is they've been very, very isolated. They have not had exposure to Western ways of thinking, of operating. So we do think that their exposure to our military, to see firsthand and to be offered that alternative vision for how militaries operate in a democratic framework has the potential to help move them away from their current patterns of behavior. We can't be absolutely sure that it will succeed, but if we don't try, we can be quite sure that it won't succeed. So we do have obviously a number of changes that we are looking for from them before we would be able to move forward, and these include obviously respect for human rights, setting up systems such as ombudsman, inspector generals, mechanisms that would allow to address human rights when they do take place. We obviously need them to be in support of the reform process, in support of the peace process, to stop use of child soldiers, we've talked about North Korea, stop dealings with North Korea, and to develop more transparent systems, budgeting, personnel, and the big difficult issues, tackle the big difficult issues of their role in politics and the economy. So there are a number of issues out there. We do feel that certain issues may be easier to tackle than others, and we do want to retain some flexibility in going forward as how we sort of leverage, our requests and what we're able to provide in exchange.
Okay, thank you. I see my time's about to expire. I'm interested in pursuing a further discussion on the previous questions under the appropriate setting. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Crowley, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I also want to express, I feel it's a homecoming for me. I served for 12 years on this committee, and I'm getting my legs back. And it's great to be back here. Thanks again to all of you for participating today. As you can tell by my opening statement, I'm a bit skeptical about the advancements that have been made, both on the ground in Burma and our interaction with the junta, the Burmese regime. But Mr. Singh, particularly, do you have plans to proceed to full IMET? I ask this because originally the State Department told us that our involvement would be limited to the DILS program before proceeding to IMET. Now, however, I believe you are seeking e-IMET funding. With such a quick change, I can only assume you will be quickly changing to full IMET request. Is that correct? And under what conditions would you consider IMET training?
Thank you, Congressman. We are not seeking full IMET, and we would not seek full IMET.
Are you seeking e-IMET?
I'll defer to my State Department colleagues. This is a Title 22 authority, not a Title 10 authority, for specific details. But e-IMET exists simply as a subset of IMET. So some form of IMET authorization is required to have e-IMET or anything anything like it. What I believe is necessary is the ability to engage in some limited amounts of training and education, narrowly targeted, that are things that are like what we have in other settings used e-IMET for. We are not particularly determined to pursue one specific way of doing that. What we'd like to do is work with Congress on what the most appropriate way would be to ensure that we have clear authority and that there is transparency and that there is accountability. And so that would be one way that we've done these sorts of activities, limited scope activities in the past. I would like to assure you that we do not see any danger. There's no one in this administration that is interested in moving down some slippery slope towards fully resuming IMET, FMF, and fully normalizing ties. Constitutional reform is out there. Elections are out there. There are years between here and there.
Well, I appreciate
but
that.
we do need to have an ability to engage and talk and help a path.
Thank you. Appreciate it. The time is very sensitive, but given the seriousness of the human rights situation in Burma, have you developed genuine benchmarks beyond broad ideas, which we're talking about? We're talking about the broad idea, the concept of the Constitution. I know this is an unworkable Constitution for nascent democracy. You're being very generous, Mr. Beck. I appreciate that. It is very nascent. Can you tell me what, if there are benchmarks, what they are? I ask this because the training of the Burmese military, even if it's on a limited basis, is a huge win, public relations-wise, for the Burmese military and for the junta.
Thank you again, Congressman. I agree with you that it's complicated to do this kind of re-engagement, and you don't want to inadvertently send the wrong kind of signals. We believe that the kind of progress we're looking for would be through, to be more specific than these general terms, full, open, regular humanitarian access for UN and other non-governmental organizations to vulnerable populations in conflict areas, transparency into military command structures and operations and how they work, some kind of independent internal review mechanism for accountability and military justice, so, like an ombudsman, like what we use, inspectors general, those kinds of, something along those lines. Process to meet the commitment, where they have made they've made progress, but progress meeting the commitment to end the use of child soldiers, an enduring commitment to the peace process. What we don't have is sort of we do specifically this and then we expect specifically that. What we are doing is trying to have a very calibrated set of initial engagements, be able to talk about these things, and then be able to evaluate in a robust way what progress has been made and whether additional steps should be taken.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the earnestness of Mr. Singh and all giving testimony today. I have many, many more questions. My time is running out. I personally don't believe that the Burmese military needs to be trained to stop killing and raping and stealing lands from people within their own country. I do hope that if anything comes from the intersection of both our military and there, is that they do stop those things. Because that's what's happening in that country today, particularly in the Kachin region, as was laid out earlier by my colleagues, in the Muslim states as well. Some outrageous and terrible and horrible things are taking place in that country. I have visited Burma, and I have a profound respect for the people in the country, certainly for Aung San Suu Kyi, and those who every day sacrifice so much to bring democracy to the country. But I am concerned that our mill-to-mill is moving too quickly because they feed off of this prestige. I want us to not only visually, but also in reality, slow this down. I think it's important to get the reforms that we want, democratic reforms, constitutional reforms, to allow Aung San Suu Kyi and others to run for office, because the Constitution will not be changed if left to the military device. They control 25% of the parliament. They are in control of the constitutional changes, not the people of Burma. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me get straight where we're at now at Burma. Are we planning to have a relationship with the Burmese military in which we are providing them with certain weapon systems? No weapons?
No.
What are we going to be providing them? We want to have transparency. We want to be accountability and everything. What are we going to give them anything in exchange for this reform?
Congressman, all we are talking about at this point would be continuing the initial engagements, which have been conversations about things like civilian control of the military and the importance of that for a modern military, the rule of law, accountability, how we approach these things and how they approach these things.
So we're asking
we'd be
them
looking to move into.
We're asking them good conversation.
Well, that's all we can do right now, sir, is have conversation. We're not able to even do training. What we would like to be able to do is actually do some training where our experts, like Captain Sanders here, who is the director of the Defense Institute for International Legal Studies and is sitting behind me, where they could offer training in how does a modern military deal with something like this.
Is there anyone, any of you three, that are suggesting that the Burmese military is not now conducting operations against the ethnic tribal people? Have they ceased? You're trying to tell us that they have ceased in these operations?
Congressman, if I may, no, we would not dispute what you are saying. But just to underscore the point that we are not talking about anything that in any way enhances their tactical warfighting ability.
Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that, because that's being realistic. I don't think good conversation accounts for anything, especially, in fact, good conversation with people who are in the process of conducting military operations that cause a great number of innocent civilians to die among the tribal populations. Good conversation with those people might be seen as a sign of weakness and not of strength. Again, we should recognize that there has been progress. It seems to me that we're talking about only progress among the Burman population. And let us remember, Aung San Suu Kyi's father was the president, was he not? And he was murdered by, what, his guards, correct me if I'm wrong, when he led the effort to make sure that the Karens and the Karenese and the Shan and the rest of those tribal people weren't going to be able to run their own schools in their own language. I mean, it seems to me, I hope that we can, and I'm sorry that our friends from the Parliament had to leave. There will not be peace in Burma for the Burmans or anyone else until compromises are reached with living with those tribal people. And this is a 1,000-year-old situation. I am glad to see that our administration is dedicated to playing a positive role, even conversation with the great emphasis is a positive role, as long as we don't ignore those violations that are going on. About Korea, however, I'm not quite understanding. They have not ceased their relationship with North Korea?
We believe they have taken steps, but we believe that to end the military-to-military ties, they have a lot of contracts and supplies from North Korea that they've had over the years. We believe they have decided to end that, but we do not believe they have completed severing that entirely. So,
Okay,
we are watching it closely, and we're very happy to discuss this in a classified setting.
All right, they've given us some good conversation on how they're changing their conversation with Korea. Of course, maybe their relationship with North Korea goes beyond conversation, which is what we're really concerned about. Well, has there been any, Burma used to be infamous, I got 30 seconds left, infamous for the drug trade that was coming out of some of the tribal areas, in fact, as we know. Has there been any progress in that front?
That is still a very big problem. They are still world's second largest producer of opium poppy. I was in Burma at the beginning of November. I went to Karen State. I heard there some really very disturbing reports about the incidence of drug use among methamphetamines coming from the north. So it's a big problem. We have done some limited counter-narcotics work with the Burmese. We're helping to finance opium yield survey, and we'd like to expand that.
All right, well, the second most heroin-producing state is Burma, and I guess the most drug-producing would be Afghanistan. And I guess we have very little influence over there, don't we? Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from the Commonwealth of Virginia, Mr. Connolly, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair, and welcome to our panel. Forgive me, I'm running back and forth, but we have two subcommittee hearings at the same time. I belong to two committees that believe no human problem or endeavor cannot substantially be improved with another hearing. Can you talk just a little bit, Mr. Singh, and maybe Ms. Efkin, about the nature of this, what seems to be the spreading violence between Buddhists and Muslims in Burma? What's the source of it?
Yes, Congressman, it is a historical problem. It's existed. It's based on deep-seated prejudices. There have been waves of violence throughout history in the country, and these latest outbreaks in the past year have been very disturbing. We very much see this as rooted in popular suspicion and prejudices, and we think with the greater opening, some of the authoritarian structures that were in place before were bad, but one thing they did do is tamp down some of these sorts of incidents. And now I think people are searching for what their identity is, and unfortunately it's given rise to bigotry, among certain segments of the population. But that, I don't think, represents the Burma. I think that there are voices for moderation there, but they have not been sufficiently heard. One thing we are doing is working with civil society to help them, give them more voice to speak up to counter this very xenophobic rhetoric. And we are working very closely with international humanitarian organizations to address the immediate humanitarian needs. We're working to try to build trust and confidence-building measures between the communities. And with regard to Karen State and the plight of the Rohingya specifically, we are pressing the government to move forward expeditiously to create a path to citizenship, because we think that once that is established, it will take away some of the underlying root cause that has given rise to the vulnerability of that group of population.
I'm glad you brought up the Rohingya, because Aung San Suu Kyi spokesperson recently said that she had little interest in supporting the Rohingya's claims for rights and citizenship. That seems a surprising statement from a Nobel laureate who was and remains a real symbol of, for democracy and freedom in Burma. Can you elaborate on our read of that statement?
Congressman, I think it does go back to the point I made about there being deep-seated societal suspicions and lack of fully embracing the diversity of the country and the strength that that diversity can bring. And I think, obviously in our conversations with all leaders, both in the government and the opposition, we do urge them to speak up in defense of those rights, those human rights.
New York Times recently had a story about a Buddhist monk, Ashin Waratu, and the 969 movement. And is it our view that the rather inflammatory sermons this Buddhist monk is recording and sharing are in fact incitement for more violence against non-Buddhists?
There is that risk, and I think that we have seen incidences where that kind of rhetoric has helped to instigate violence. I do think that we've seen signs more recently that the government is more seized with the importance of tamping down this kind of rhetoric. In my visit to Karen State, I had the opportunity to meet with religious leaders, including a prominent monk and a prominent imam, and they both told me that in the past months they had formed an interfaith council, that they met regularly, that in any instances of any perceived provocations, the government was very quick to call this council to meet, and it seemed that at least in that one instance, the situation had improved, and I think that that sort of effort is taking place in many parts of the country, though it's still not yet sufficient to address the problem.
Do we sense, yes?
Congressman, if I
Mr.
might
Yudek.
add, also we're working with youth because to build their awareness of the core issue and using social media, which they're increasingly accessing. So we're working through Facebook and other social media outlets to develop early warning systems, to educate, to bring people together, especially young people, young leaders, to begin addressing this issue and to be able, when it becomes inflamed again, to address it and to initiate an early warning system. So the early warning system is working with faith-based organizations, or with other civil society organizations, and also working with the President's office. That's becoming increasingly aware and building their capacity also to step in at the early moments.
Is there sufficient appreciation within the government that this violence left unchecked could significantly retard the ability of Burma, Myanmar to reemerge in the family of nations?
I do believe there is recognition. Our ambassador, Derek Mitchell, has been very prominent leading diplomatic efforts in the country. He meets regularly with other international partners to review the situation, discuss what should be done. He recently led a mission to Rakhine State along with two key Burmese ministers and to get a better handle on the situation, saw where the problems are, where there's some signs of progress. I should mention also the State Department has, our Conflict Stabilization Office also has an officer based at the embassy in Rangoon who's dedicated to this issue.
The gentleman's time has expired.
I thank the chair and I thank the panel.
Thank you. The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Franks, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you again for holding this important hearing, and thank you all for being here. Among the many challenges that some of us are concerned about, and probably one of the most significant concerns I have, is the Burmese military's continued use of rape as a weapon of war and the recruitment of child soldiers. Despite a 2012 UN action plan to halt Burma's recruitment of child soldiers, this has continued. And a little over a month ago, our office received yet another report that Burma Army soldiers attacked predominantly Christian Kachin villages, where they brutally gang raped 2 young girls. And these are, of course, just a couple of very well-documented patterns of sexual violence by the Burmese Army. And Human Rights Watch has also closely documented how the Burmese military's recruitment and use of child soldiers continues. So I guess I have sort of a series of three main questions, and I'll direct them to you, Mr. Singh, if that's all right. First, how does DOD justify engagement with the military that has a long and recent record of committing these what should be called crimes against humanity? And second, considering the Burmese military's history of failing to meet its requirements, what reassurances were given to the U.S. that the Burmese military will disband its child soldiers and use of rape as a weapon of war? And finally, has the Obama administration implemented any strategies to effectively measure policies intended to decrease the number of child soldiers and the use of rape as a weapon of war?
Thank you, Congressman. I greatly appreciate your interest and your raising of what are among the most fundamental issues that face us and that face all of us as we think about what our policy towards Burma should be and how it should proceed. There is no doubt that the Burmese military has a long history of substantial abuses, and that human rights abuses continue, including the kinds that you have mentioned, the most disturbing kinds. We absolutely do not believe that it is time now for any kind of comprehensive re-engagement beyond the areas that we think will help this military move towards reform. We do not believe that the military will stop being an important factor in Burmese society. We do believe it needs to find a way out of being in the political and economic life, and it needs to find a way to transform itself into a responsible, credible, accountable institution that will start protecting its people instead of persecuting and threatening its people. And it is our considered view that very limited, calibrated engagement is actually better than non-engagement, with a clear sense that normalization would require a lot of things to happen, some of which I mentioned in earlier question and answer and in my earlier testimony. I would like to turn to
before you shift, but would those engagements consider implementing strategies to sort of effectively measure policies that were intended to decrease the number of child soldiers and the use of rape as a weapon of war?
And that would be, actually, I think I'll turn to Judith for precisely that piece about how we in the State Department together are looking at that exact issue.
Very much, that's very much, yeah, at the forefront, one of the conditions that we are looking at. I will tell you possibly some glimmers of hope that the government has signed up to a UN action plan to cease the use of child soldiers. Under that plan, there's been some limited progress of releases of child soldiers. And one of the sticking points has been allowing international access to military facilities to be able to verify whether or not there are child soldiers. That has been somewhat stalled, but just recently there was some limited progress of allowing international observers into some facilities. Possibly one thing worth mentioning, it's not only the Burmese military, but also some of the armed ethnic groups that have also been guilty on child soldiers. So that's another problem that needs to be tackled.
The only thing I would add to that, and USAID has programming that is also aimed at helping with this issue, and Greg might want to speak to it, but I would also add that the government of Burma has taken a very strong stance saying that they're going to address this problem, and then we want to help them live up to that commitment. They're going to address the problem of violence, they're going to address the problem of child soldiers.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would just hope that these things should be kept in mind because, you know, America's perspective, if it's not clearly elucidated in these areas, then you got to wonder why we're doing any of this.
I thank the gentleman. His time has expired. Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're just going to continue down this line. I think it's a line worth continuing. And you, basically the comment was just made, and one of the things I want to go back to frame this a little better. I've listened in part of this, and I've been, like Mr. Connolly, bouncing with a couple other subcommittees, but one of the things that I've heard since I've been here and also reading through testimony before is we're engaging them. We are doing these things. I have maybe just a basic question. Maybe it's just too basic for this, but I was like, what is their willingness to actually be engaged? And I think that's maybe a base question we need to ask here. Anybody want to try that one?
If we're focusing on military to military, I can certainly start with that.
Try that, and then we'll go to this.
More broadly, it's actually, you know, this is a very interesting moment. I mean, honestly, with many countries, the kind of programming that I'm talking about, starting some initial engagements and some initial trainings on things like the rule of law, human rights, and other things, those are often not very welcome. And I would say, having joined the State Department for the first human rights dialogue in Burma a year ago or so, I was really surprised by the interest and almost enthusiasm about understanding what it is the United States is wanting to talk to them about in these areas. There are certainly going to be Burmese military officers who don't want to reform. and we'll see a lot to lose. But we believe there will be those Burmese military officers and leaders who want to reform and see a path towards being a respected institution. And right now, there is an eagerness and welcoming of this kind of engagement, and we believe that is an opportunity we should take advantage of.
And before we try, is that an eagerness on a lower, being in military, is this a lower officer level or a leadership level? Really, where was the engagement there?
I would say it's been both. We probably engaged more with some leadership, but the fact is this is an institution we hardly know. We've had no engagement for so long that we are in early days. And so leadership and sort of that middle and upper tier, we are definitely seeing indications that there's an interest in this kind of engagement. And we believe we should see where it goes, but one thing I would stress is be able to calibrate. We can do a little more, but if things don't go right, we can do a little less.
Okay. Well, before you go, or go ahead.
Certainly, no, I was also going to make the point that the human rights dialogue was actually quite successful in terms of the candor of the discussion, including with the military. And we do sense, as Vikram Singh said, that there's certainly some quarters that are very receptive to the messages we have. I think it may be worth noting that many of those in the government leading the reforms currently are former military officers. So it seems to indicate that even before there were some beginning to think about the need to do things differently. And I think we shouldn't underestimate their desire for international respect, which some realize requires a completely different mode of operation and behavior.
Well, and I think the other thing here is we're dealing with a country that has had to deal or has worked, through many situations which are outside what I'll call international norms, international, of standing within the community. They may see it, but they see it from a very different perspective we do, as far as how do you live among an international community and what are those standards because of the violence, because of the drug trades, everything, and also just a part of the world that's very difficult. That is the concern that I have, and it's not to belabor this point, and I think the only concern that I have in what I've heard is laying out, because undoubtedly if there is some interest to talk about these things, and again, we can get into several that my friend from Arizona and others talk about, is having more tangible, as it gets to that point, benchmarks to say, if we come to here, then we can offer this. And I think as we go forward, and I think that is, because it did say when they joined the UN plan on this soldier, child soldier, I think your comment is that, limited progress, but yet what you said is they really didn't get on to verify. So my concern will be how we define limited progress. Does that mean we got to go to the gate and look through the gate, or did they actually let somebody in unfiltered? So again, I appreciate your work. This is not an easy part of the world. I'm not saying there's an easy solution. And really that willingness to communicate sometimes is more, at this stage, maybe more than what we can hope for. But I'm sure we'll do this. And Mr. Chairman, I know you've been vigilant in this category, and we'll continue to look at this part of the world. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, and the gentleman's time has expired. We're going to have votes here in just a minute, so I just have a couple of more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. This summer, during a trip to Europe, President Thein Sein promised to release all political prisoners by the end of the year. Subsequently, some, but not all political prisoners have been released conditionally. At the same time, there has been a significant rise in political prisoners in the months following President Thein Sein's pledge. More than 200 activists are now currently facing trial under old restrictive laws and the new Peaceful Assembly Act. In addition, more than 1,000 Rohingya have been detained unlawfully since mid-2012 and subjected to cruel and degrading treatment in many instances. Well over 500 farmers face trespassing charges for their plowing protests over government confiscation of their land. Given that the release of political prisoners was a key factor in the decision to suspend sanctions against Burma and increase our economic relationship with the Burmese government, what changes, if any, will the administration make to address this troubling trend and double talk by the Burmese government? Ms. Stephanie.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, let me just make a few brief comments, and I think my colleague Greg Beck may be able to add more. But you really hit the nail on the head when you talked about the arrests being made under old, deficient laws. Fortunately, there is a recognition that those laws are deficient. There is an effort underway by Parliament to amend these laws, to change, revise these laws, and we have some indications that there's progress being made on the Assembly law that is the cause or the basis for many of the arrests you just cited. Mr. Beck already mentioned success that our AID mission was very instrumental in facilitating working towards a much better Assembly law. So those are a couple of points. One other point I would make briefly is that one of the things the government has done is established a mechanism, a committee that's reviewing those currently incarcerated to determine which are prisoners of conscience, and that committee does include former political prisoners on the committee. We think it's a good mechanism. We think it's making progress, and we want to see it continue to operate and make progress.
Thank you. Mr. Beck, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would just add that as part of the U.S. mission, USAID is pursuing a calculated policy engagement that really does test the political will of the government of Burma. So targeting these key areas that will affect the people in the most impactful way: agriculture, economic reform, media. We've been working very closely with the Parliament to draft laws of association, the Farmer Protection Act on land use policies that really rise to international standards. When they initially were drafted, they were horrible. But we have seen a willingness from some of the key reformers to listen and to engage with their citizens, and the end result has been a fairly significant and positive advancement on those particular laws that we think will be most effective in really addressing the priority issues of the people of Burma.
Thank you. And the bells you hear are the votes being called, but I just have two more questions. The State Department June 2013 report on human trafficking showed that in 2012 alone, Burma's Department of Social Welfare received 195 repatriated victims. In addition, there are reports that the unofficial count could be higher, with UNICEF placing the estimated number of Burmese girls trafficked to the Thailand brothels at 10,000 every year. In light of this information, could you please outline the impact that existing initiatives have had on human trafficking in Burma, and what does the State Department hope to see from the next anti-TIP dialogue? Ms. Sefkin?
Yes, I would say that somewhat in line with the human rights dialogue that we referenced a few moments ago, we actually were quite gratified by the level of the discussion that took place at the last TIP trafficking in persons dialogue. And I think actually the ball's a bit in our court right now to follow through on some commitments that we made to identify funding necessary to help support the action plan that they derived to begin to seriously tackle this problem.
All right, thank you. And then one more question, and we'll let you go. In 2011, the GAO reported that UN and U.S. agencies assisted Burma after a devastating cyclone with about $335 million in assistance, but that U.S. agencies needed to strengthen their monitoring of assistance. The report detailed that USAID took actions to help ensure U.S. funds were used as intended and did not benefit sanctioned entities, but that it had some monitoring weaknesses. In light of the ongoing concerns with rampant corruption and efforts taken by the military to benefit from Burma's newfound investment wealth, what actions has USAID taken to monitor its assistance to ensure it is reaching the intended recipients? And also, what effect, if any, has having an in-country presence had on USAID projects and programs aimed at addressing human rights issues, and what progress have you achieved so far?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
As a side, I did want to say that while I didn't have an opportunity to present welcoming from my parents to my congressman, I did want to introduce my daughter, Tona, who is here with us today, who's
That's
traveled.
even better.
She's traveled to Burma, and she lived on the Thai-Burma border for 4 years, so this is an important issue for our family.
Well, we welcome her today as well.
Thank you. And thank you for raising this point. It is very important. Dr. Shah has been relentless in focusing on monitoring and evaluation of our programs for results. As regards to Burma, we've actually increased our staffing from what was previously 2.5 years ago, one personal service contractor We now have 24 staff on the ground, Foreign Service officers and national staff. Allows us the ability to have much more access, to have the ability to be out there, to monitor our programs, to build the capacity of both our international NGOs, but as part of USAID Forward, we're also building the capacity of local organizations who have the contextual understanding, who understand the dynamics of the community, also are able to identify where those sort of rent-seeking opportunities are and to be able to address those, recognizing what our regulations are. And so we really do monitor very closely. It's built into our grants. It's built into our contracts. So I think we've made tremendous progress since that report came out.
Thank you very much. Just a little aside, for many years, been in Congress quite a few years and other offices prior to that. Sometimes I would speak at schools, and sometimes it was my kids' schools, and sometimes I'd recognize my daughter or son in the audience, and whenever I did, you know, it was always, "Dad, why did you embarrass me like that?" And so your daughter was blushing and very embarrassed, I'm sure. Anything you want to say about your dad while we've got the opportunity? But we do appreciate the panel's testimony. It was very helpful this afternoon. And I know some of the members were fairly aggressive, but that's the nature of the committee, as you probably know. But I think you all handled yourselves very well. All members will have 5 days to supplement their statements or to submit additional questions should they wish to do so. And if there's no further business to come before the committee, we're adjourned. Thank you.